There are 4 basic facts for you to know about a controller. Now remember, the job of a controller is to control the information that we need to put on a page, or in an editing scenario, to save the information that a user is typing into the page. And to bring a controller to life, the first thing we'll see is a new directive, the ng-controller directive. ng-controller is an attribute that we place into our HTML. So just like ng-app is a directive, ng-controller is another directive. And when we use ng-controller, we can specify the name of a controller that we want to take control of some area of the HTML. So in this code snippet, ng-app will initialize Angular, and Angular will take control of that div and everything inside of it. Inside of that div is a child div where we can put something called the main controller in charge. So ng-controller can only be used where we have an ng-app in place, and we have to tell Angular the name of the controller that will be in charge. In this case, the controller is main controller, and we have to name these controllers because in large applications you can have dozens and dozens of different controllers to use. So now the question is, how does Angular know where this controller lives? And the answer is that we'll need to create a controller with that name, main controller, and we can do that by writing a function and assigning the function to a variable with a matching name. As you can see in this code snippet, controllers are just functions. We don't invoke these functions. Angular will invoke this controller function when it needs to create a controller to manage an area of the web page. And when Angular creates our controller, it can pass a parameter to our function, a parameter we call scope with a $sign in front, $scope. You'll encounter a few things with $signs in the front when you work with Angular, and just like the ng prefix, the $sign prefix is a sign that the component you're working with is a component provided by Angular. What we can do with the scope argument is assign our model to that object. So $scope is not the model, but things that we attach to that scope are going to be the model. In the code snippet, we've only attached a single property to scope. It's called message, and it points to the string hello. This will now make message available to us inside the HTML so we can data bind it into the display. Let's take a look at how that works. Here I am on the Plunker web page. I've just created a brand new plunk, but I haven't made any changes to it yet. Let's get set up to use Angular and create our first controller. So we know one way to get Angular is to come into the list of packages and just tell Plunker to install Angular for me. That's going to put in the script reference that points to angular.js. And once I have that in place, I'll need an ng-app directive. I'm just going to place that on the HTML element, but it could go anywhere. And what I want to do ultimately is put a controller in charge of the body and everything inside of it, and provide the ability to write out some sort of custom message. So instead of the page displaying hello Plunker, I want to be able to display something like hello Angular or hello Scott. And to do that, I will create the controller and I'll call it main controller. Now, a lot of people who work with Angular and a lot of the documentation you'll come across, you'll see that people abbreviate the name controller to just CTRL, and that's fine. That works perfectly well. It doesn't matter if you spell it this way or the long way, really just as long as you're consistent inside of an application, that's what would matter. I prefer to type out the word and just have main controller the full word. I'm not a big fan of abbreviations these days, unless they're really necessary. So now I'm asking for a controller, and if I were to run this web page, I would find that I have some errors collecting inside of my console. If I look at that, one of the errors that will be here is Angular complaining that it cannot find a main controller, which makes sense. We haven't written that yet, so let's do that. Inside of script.js, which is included in this page, I'm going to define a variable, main controller. And is this variable a global variable? Yes, it is, because I'm defining it outside of any other code. We'll come back and fix that later. But this main controller will be the controller that Angular is looking for, and one of the parameters that you can always pass into a controller is $scope. As we work through the course, we'll see there are other parameters that you can accept into a controller function. But for right now, we just need this one, which is $scope. And now I can attach one or more things to that scope. So I can attach something called message and set it equal to hello Angular. And now when my page refreshes, I have this model, which is a message attached to my scope, and I have it displaying in the web page thanks to the data binding expression from Angular. And if you think about it, perhaps you can see why that argument that is passed to my controller function is called scope, because it is establishing a scope where the data binding expressions are evaluated against. So if I have something in my HTML called message, where is Angular going to look for message? It's going to look for it on the scope object for the controller that is associated with that section of the HTML. And I can do some fancier expressions. So inside of the HTML, I could say, let's output not message, but message.length, because every string has a length property, and the length of that particular string is 15 characters. That might not be what I want to display to the user, but that was a perfectly valid expression inside of the curly braces. If I were to take that expression, the h1 that is inside of this body, and move it outside of the HTML element that has this ng controller directive, then it would no longer work. I'd be trying to find a message, and the only place a message exists right now is inside of the main controller. So I have to use this expression inside of the body tag that is specifying a controller that makes that message available. Let's build on this example in the next clip.